The appointment slots always fill themselves on Tuesday afternoons at 3:17. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been running the digital scheduling system at Riverside Memorial Crematory for 8 years now. I know every quirk of our software, every glitch in the database, every automated reminder that keeps our operation running smoothly. What I don't know is how Margaret Holloway keeps booking appointments 6 months after I cremated her myself. The first time I noticed it was in late September. I was updating our weekly schedule when I saw the familiar green block indicating a confirmed appointment. Margaret Holloway, Tuesday, 3:17 p.m., pre-need consultation. I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to place the name. Then I remembered Mrs. Holloway, the retired librarian with the gentle smile who'd prepaid for her cremation services 3 years ago. We'd completed her service in March. I clicked into the appointment details, expecting to find some clerical error or duplicate entry. The system showed her pre-need contract number, her contact information, even her preferred date range, all accurate. But under service status, instead of completed like it should have read, the field simply said pending. I deleted the appointment and moved on with my day. Tuesday morning, it was back. Same time, same client, same pending status. This time, I spent 20 minutes cross-referencing our completion records. Margaret Holloway, service date March 15th, 2024. Cremation completed. Remains released to family. Contract fulfilled. I had the paperwork to prove it, my own signature on the final disposition form. I deleted the appointment again, then spent another hour scrubbing our database for any duplicate entries or corrupted records. Nothing. Our system was clean. But Wednesday morning brought something new. The appointment had returned, but now there was a note attached. Please confirm service date with family. I called our software vendor that afternoon. Janet, our usual tech support contact, walked me through the standard troubleshooting protocols. We checked for user permissions, looked for scheduled automated tasks, even rebuilt the appointment module from scratch. The system was functioning perfectly, she assured me. No explanation for recurring entries that shouldn't exist. Thursday morning, family requests evening service. Friday, special handling required. I stopped deleting the appointments. Something about the messages felt wrong, like I was being prompted to take action I didn't understand. Instead, I started printing screenshots, building a file of evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. The notes grew more specific. Please coordinate with transport. Confirm chapel availability. Rush processing requested. Each message appeared overnight, written in the system's standard appointment notation format, but containing requests that made no sense for a completed case. I began staying late on Monday evenings, watching the system, waiting to catch whatever process was generating these entries. The crematory was quiet after hours, just the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional settling of the building. I'd sit at my desk with the appointment calendar open, hitting refresh every few minutes. Nothing ever happened while I watched. 2 weeks into October, I decided to call Margaret Holloway's family. I pulled her file and found her daughter's contact information. Linda Holloway answered on the second ring. Mrs. Chen? Her voice carried surprise. Is everything all right? Is there a problem with Mom's arrangements? I explained about the recurring appointments, trying to keep my tone professional and calm. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. That's impossible, Linda finally said. We handled everything in March. We scattered her ashes at the lake just like she wanted. There's nothing left to arrange. I know this sounds strange, I continued, but our system keeps generating these appointments, and some of the notes mention coordinating with family. Miss Chen, Linda interrupted, her voice strained. My mother died in February. We cremated her in March. This conversation is over. The line went dead. That night, I dreamed about Margaret Holloway. In the dream, she was sitting in our consultation office, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting patiently while I fumbled through paperwork I couldn't quite read. I have an appointment, she kept saying, checking a watch that wasn't there. I have an appointment at 3:17. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. The next Tuesday, I did something I'd never done before. I cleared my afternoon schedule and waited in the consultation office at 3:15. If something was going to happen, if this recurring appointment meant anything at all, I wanted to be there. 3:16 came and went. 3:17. 3:18. At 3:19, my computer chimed with a new message notification. The appointment system had logged a completed consultation for Margaret Holloway. Service notes read, "Client satisfied with arrangements. Proceeded as scheduled." But I'd been sitting alone in that room the entire time. I checked the security cameras. The footage showed me at my desk, then walking to the consultation office, then sitting in the empty room for 20 minutes. No other person entered the building. No one sat across from my desk. No consultation took place. Yet the system recorded a 45-minute meeting with detailed service preferences, updated payment information, and a new request. Please schedule cremation for next available date. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. Margaret Holloway had been cremated 6 months ago. I had the documentation. I had the completion records. I had her daughter's confirmation that the ashes had been scattered. But our system disagreed. That Thursday, the appointment notes changed again. Thank you for accommodating the delay. Ready to proceed. I tried calling Linda Holloway back, but her number had been disconnected. I drove to the address we had on Philia Tidy Ranch House with a for sale sign planted in the front yard. The realtor's card stapled to the sign was weathered and faded, suggesting the house had been empty for months. I started checking obituaries, death certificates, anything that might explain what was happening. Margaret Holloway had died February 28, 2024. Natural causes, no unusual circumstances. Her daughter Linda was listed as the surviving next of kin. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the appointments that kept appearing, except for the consultation that happened while I sat alone, except for the growing certainty that Margaret Holloway was still waiting for something I didn't understand. On the following Tuesday, I decided not to fight it anymore. I walked into the consultation office at 3:15, sat down at my desk, and opened Margaret's file, the real one, the completed one from March. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Holloway," I said to the empty chair across from me. "I apologize for the delay in getting back to you." The room felt different immediately, warmer, quieter, like someone was listening. I reviewed her original preferences, her payment history, her special requests. I spoke about our commitment to dignified service, our attention to detail, our understanding that death was just another transition requiring careful handling. When I finished, I looked up at the empty chair and said, "Is there anything else you need from us today?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Then my computer chimed softly, and a new note appeared in the appointment system. "Service completed. Contract fulfilled. Thank you." I never saw another recurring appointment for Margaret Holloway. But sometimes, on Tuesday afternoons when the crematory is quiet and the light slants through the consultation office windows in just the right way, I save that time slot. Just in case someone else needs to finish what they started. Just in case there are arrangements that extend beyond the paperwork we keep in our files. Because I've learned that some appointments can't be canceled, only completed. And completion doesn't always happen when we think it should. The scale doesn't lie, but sometimes I wish it would. I'm Vincent Torres, and I've been operating cremation equipment at Westfield Memorial for 15 years. In that time, I've processed over 3,000 bodies, and I know the mathematics of reduction by heart. A 180-pound man becomes roughly 4 to 6 pounds of bone ash after cremation. The process is precise, predictable, governed by laws of physics that have never failed me. Until Harold Kellerman. My shift starts at 6 a.m., when the building is still quiet and the retort chambers have cooled from overnight operations. I review the previous day's completions, check maintenance logs, and prepare for the day's scheduled cremations. It's methodical work that requires attention to detail and respect for the gravity of what we do. Families trust us with their most precious loss, and I take that responsibility seriously. The preparation room smells of industrial disinfectant and something deeper, not unpleasant, just the clean scent of a space dedicated to final transitions. I've grown comfortable with the rhythm of it, the soft hum of refrigeration units, the whisper of air filtration systems, the occasional creak of the building settling into another day. Mr. Kellerman arrived on a Thursday evening transport from Mercy General. The intake paperwork listed him as 73 years old, 180 pounds, death by cardiac arrest. Standard procedure. His family had chosen our basic cremation package with a memorial service scheduled for the following week. I processed him Friday morning, following the same protocols I'd performed thousands of times before: visual identification, removal of medical devices, placement in the cremation container. Everything by the book. The retort fired at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cycle completed in 3 hours and 20 minutes, exactly what I'd expect for someone his size. But when I opened the chamber, something felt wrong. The bone fragments looked normal at first glance, the typical gray-white ash that remains after organic matter burns away. But as I transferred the remains to the processing unit, I noticed the weight. The cremation paddle felt heavier than it should have, requiring more effort to lift and maneuver. I told myself it was fatigue. Friday afternoon tiredness, nothing more. The processing unit pulverizes larger bone fragments into uniform ash, and I've run thousands of bodies through its mechanisms. The machine has a steady rhythm, a familiar sound profile that I can monitor without looking. But with Mr. Kellerman's remains, the processor labored differently. The motor strained, working harder than normal, as if grinding through something denser than bone. When the cycle finished, I weighed the final remains according to protocol. Our digital scale is calibrated monthly and has never shown an error larger than a few ounces. I placed the collection pan on the platform and watched the numbers climb. 10 pounds, 20, 30, 40. The scale stopped at 239.7 pounds. I stared at the display, certain I'd made an error. A 180-pound man cannot produce 240 pounds of ash. Mass doesn't increase during cremation. It reduces by roughly 96%. This violated every principle of physics I understood. I recalibrated the scale, tested it with standard weights, ran every diagnostic protocol in our manual. The equipment functioned perfectly. I weighed the remains again, 239.7 pounds. I called my supervisor, Janet Morrison, who'd been managing crematory operations for 25 years. She arrived within an hour, took one look at the scale readout, and went silent for a long moment. "Run the metal detector," she said finally. Our metal detection protocol identifies surgical implants, jewelry, or other foreign objects that families might have missed during preparation. I'd already completed this step during intake and found nothing unusual, but I ran Mr. Kellerman's remains through the detector again. The machine immediately began signaling, not the sharp, clear tone that indicates metal, but a deeper, more complex sound like multiple substances registering simultaneously. The digital display showed traces of titanium, which made sense for someone his age who might have had dental work or joint replacements. But it also detected iron, copper, and something the machine classified as unknown metallic compound. "That's not possible," Janet murmured, reviewing the detection results. "We removed his pacemaker during intake. There wasn't anything else." I ran the detection sequence 3 more times. Each scan produced the same results. Multiple metallic substances that shouldn't exist in cremated remains, present in quantities that defied explanation. Janet called our equipment vendor, who suggested we submit a sample for laboratory analysis. We'd never done this before. The suggestion felt like admitting we didn't understand our own processes, but the situation had moved beyond standard troubleshooting. While we waited for lab results, I couldn't stop thinking about the weight. I'd carry Mr. Kellerman's remains to the storage area, feeling the unusual heft in my arms. The ash felt different, denser, somehow more present than typical cremated remains. When I held the container, I could sense something that normal bone ash didn't possess, a substantiality that seemed to press back against my hands. The laboratory called Tuesday morning with results that made no sense. The sample contained the expected calcium phosphate and trace minerals from human bone, but also significant quantities of elements that shouldn't exist in any biological context. Iron in concentrations found in industrial applications, copper compounds typically used in electrical manufacturing, and approximately 12% of the sample consisted of materials the lab couldn't identify at all. The unknown components don't match any reference standards in our database, the technician explained. Whatever these substances are, they're not naturally occurring in human remains. I asked about contamination, perhaps. Something from our equipment had mixed with the ash during processing. The technician ruled this out. The foreign materials were integrated at a molecular level, not simply mixed in. They appeared to be part of the cremated tissue itself. Janet and I reviewed every step of Mr. Kellerman's processing, looking for any deviation from protocol. We checked our equipment logs, examined the retort chamber for foreign material, even tested other recent cremations for similar anomalies. Everything else appeared normal. Only Harold Kellerman had produced impossible results. That evening, I stayed late to research our records. Mr. Kellerman had prepaid for his cremation services 18 months earlier, during a routine pre-need consultation. The sales notes described him as a retired machinist who'd worked 47 years at Consolidated Manufacturing downtown. He'd been polite, thorough, and had asked detailed questions about our cremation process, specifically about temperatures, timing, and what happened to different materials under extreme heat. I found myself wondering what a machinist might know about metals and high-temperature processing that the rest of us didn't. The next morning, I decided to visit Consolidated Manufacturing. The plant had closed in 2018, but the security guard who met me at the gate remembered Harold Kellerman. Harold worked the specialty metals division, he told me. Real precise guy, always experimenting with new alloys and heat treatments. Heard he'd been developing some kind of revolutionary process before the plant shut down, but I never knew the details. I pressed for more information, but the guard had little else to offer. The plant's records had been destroyed when the building sold, and most of the former employees had scattered to other jobs or retirement. Driving back to the crematory, I kept thinking about Mr. Kellerman's final months. A retired machinist with expertise in metallurgy, asking detailed questions about cremation temperatures. A man who'd spent decades working with experimental alloys, facing his own mortality with the systematic mind of someone who understood how materials behaved under extreme conditions. When I returned to work, I stood in the storage area looking at Mr. Kellerman's remains. 239.7 pounds of ash that contained impossible elements, materials that shouldn't exist in human tissue. But as I held the container, feeling its unnatural weight, I began to understand that Harold Kellerman had achieved something unprecedented. He'd found a way to take his life's work with him. I never learned how he'd done it, what process or substances he'd used to alter his body's chemistry, or how long he'd been preparing for this final transformation. The laboratory analysis raised more questions than it answered, and Mr. Kellerman's family seemed as puzzled as we were when we explained the unusual results. But sometimes, when I'm working alone in the crematory and the building settles into its evening quiet, I think about the weight of his remains. About a man who'd spent his career shaping metals and understanding heat, who'd faced death not as an ending, but as another kind of transformation. About the precise, deliberate way he'd asked questions about our processes, as if he were planning something we couldn't imagine. I still weigh every cremation according to protocol, and the mathematics work exactly as they should, but I've learned that some people carry more than flesh and bone into the fire. Some carry knowledge, preparation, and intentions that survive even the most complete combustion. Harold Kellerman proved that death doesn't have to mean the end of everything we've worked to create. Sometimes, it just means taking our achievements with us into whatever comes next. Some fires burn without fuel, but they still leave ash behind. I'm Dawn Practices, and I've supervised night operations at Clearview Memorial Crematory for 11 years. The graveyard shift suits me fewer interruptions, no family visits, just the quiet routine of maintaining equipment and preparing for the next day's services. Night work in a crematory isn't as unsettling as people imagine. Death keeps regular hours here, processed with dignity and care during daylight. The darkness just gives me space to ensure everything runs smoothly. The building settles differently at night. Old brick and steel expanding and contracting, pipes humming with water circulation, the steady whisper of air filtration systems. I've learned to distinguish normal sounds from the unusual ones, and after 11 years, very little surprises me anymore. I work alone most nights, checking equipment status, reviewing the next day's schedule, and completing maintenance logs. The cremation chambers, we call them retorts, stay powered down after evening operations, cooling slowly until morning crews arrive. Standard protocol requires manual startup procedures and multiple safety checks before any cremation can begin. The systems are designed to prevent accidental activation, which made the first midnight firing so disturbing. It happened on a Tuesday in September, around 2:30 in the morning. I was updating inventory records when I heard the distinctive whoosh of gas ignition from the cremation hall. At first, I assumed one of the day supervisors had scheduled an emergency cremation and forgotten to update the night log. But when I checked our system, no services were scheduled until Thursday. I walked to the cremation hall and found retort number 3 running at full temperature 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, well into its normal cremation cycle. The control panel showed all systems functioning normally, as if someone had manually initiated the startup sequence and loaded a body for processing. But the chamber was empty when I'd locked the building at 6 p.m. I followed emergency protocols and shut down the unit immediately. The chamber had been running for approximately 40 minutes, long enough to complete most of a normal cremation cycle. When I opened the door after cooling, I found a thin layer of ash distributed across the chamber floor, maybe 2 or 3 ounces total, far less than a complete cremation would produce. I collected the ash for analysis and filed an incident report with our corporate office. Equipment malfunctions happen, and our insurance requires documentation of any unexpected activations. The technician who inspected the retort the next day found no mechanical problems. All safety systems functioned properly. All sensors read normal values. All programming remained unchanged. Must have been a power surge, he concluded. Sometimes electrical fluctuations can trigger startup sequences, but power surges don't explain the ash. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Same retort, same time 2:33 a.m. exactly. Same 40-minute cycle, same thin layer of ash afterward. This time, I didn't shut down the unit immediately. Instead, I watched through the observation window as the flames burned steadily in the empty chamber, consuming nothing visible yet somehow producing residue. I called our corporate emergency line, but the overnight supervisor seemed more concerned about liability than investigation. Follow standard shutdown procedures, she instructed. Document everything and we'll review it in the morning. The ash analysis came back inconclusive. Human cremated remains, the lab reported, but too small a sample for detailed identification. No unusual materials, no foreign substances, just bone ash in quantities consistent with partial cremation. I started staying closer to retort 3 during my rounds, particularly as 2:30 a.m. approached. Most nights, nothing happened. The chamber remained cold and silent, just another piece of expensive equipment waiting for morning operations. But every few weeks, always on different days with no predictable pattern, the ignition sequence would activate precisely at 2:33. I began timing the cycles more carefully. Ignition at 2:33, full temperature reached by 2:45, sustained burning until 3:33, then automatic shutdown. Exactly 1 hour of cremation time, the standard duration for an average-sized adult body. The 4th incident occurred on a Thursday in November. This time, I positioned myself in the cremation hall before 2:30, watching retort 3's control panel for any sign of activation. The building was completely quiet, no electrical storms, no power fluctuations, no external interference of any kind. At 2:32, the panel's status lights began illuminating in sequence. First, the preheat cycle, then gas flow indicators, then ignition. Each step followed proper startup protocol, as if an experienced operator were working through the activation checklist, but no one touched the controls. I watched invisible hands guide the system through procedures I'd performed thousands of times myself. The process was flawless, professional, executed with the precision of someone who understood crematory operations intimately. During the burning cycle, I thought I heard something beyond the normal sound of gas flames, a faint rhythmic pattern, almost like breathing, but deeper and slower than human respiration. I pressed my ear to the chamber door and listened more carefully. The sound wasn't coming from inside. The retort seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the building were drawing slow, deliberate breaths. When the cycle completed and the chamber cooled, I found more ash than previous incidents. Still not a full cremation's worth, but perhaps 6 or 7 ounces distributed evenly across the fire bricks. I collected every trace for analysis, photographed the scene, and documented the timeline in meticulous detail. The lab results provided our first real clue. The ash contained bone fragments from at least 3 different individuals to adults and what appeared to be a child or adolescent. Carbon dating suggested the remains were decades old, possibly from the 1970s or 80s. I researched our facility's history and discovered that Clearview Memorial had operated continuously since 1962, but under different ownership until 1998. Previous records were sparse, but I found references to a major renovation in 1987 following operational irregularities that resulted in state licensing review. The irregularities weren't specified in the documents I could access, but the timing aligned with the carbon dating results. I contacted the State Crematory Licensing Board and spoke with a longtime inspector who remembered the 1987 investigation. Record-keeping problems, he told me carefully. Some cremations that didn't match the paperwork. Families who paid for services but never received remains. The kind of problems that happen when oversight gets lax. He wouldn't provide details, citing confidentiality requirements, but his tone suggested more serious issues than simple administrative errors. The midnight firings continued through winter, always following the same pattern. I started a detailed log, recording dates, times, ash quantities, and any environmental factors that might influence the activations. No clear pattern emerged, but I noticed the incidents seemed to cluster around certain dates' anniversaries, perhaps, or significant calendar markers I couldn't identify. In February, I decided to stay in the cremation hall during an entire firing cycle. I wanted to observe the complete process, to understand what was actually burning in that empty chamber. When retort 3 ignited at 2:33, I positioned myself at the observation window and watched carefully for any visual anomaly. The flames burned normally for the first 20 minutes. Standard cremation fire, blue-white and intensely hot, exactly what I'd expect to see during routine operations. But as the cycle progressed, I began to notice irregularities in the flame patterns, subtle shifts in color and intensity that suggested the presence of combustible material, though the chamber appeared empty. Around 3 o'clock, I saw something that made me step back from the window. Shadows moved within the flames, not random flickers, but deliberate shapes that seemed to writhe and shift with purpose. 3 distinct forms, 2 larger and 1 smaller, turning slowly in the fire, as if finally free to complete transformations that had been interrupted decades ago. I understood then that retort 3 wasn't malfunctioning. It was finishing work that had been left undone, completing cremations that had never been properly performed. The midnight fires were burning away evidence of old negligence, reducing forgotten remains to ash that could finally rest. When the cycle ended and I collected the ash, I felt a profound sense of completion rather than fear. These weren't hauntings or supernatural manifestations, they were corrections, the crematory itself ensuring that every body received the dignity of proper reduction. I never reported my observations to corporate management. Some things are better left to complete themselves, in their own time, in their own way. The midnight firings still occur, but less frequently now. I think retort 3 is nearly finished with its work, burning through the last of whatever was left incomplete all those years ago. When my shift ends each morning, I make sure to check the ash collection from any overnight activations. I handle it with the same respect I'd show any family's remains, because that's what it is, someone's final resting place, finally receiving the careful attention it should have gotten decades ago. The building breathes easier these days, and so do I. Perfect paperwork doesn't lie, but it can't explain the impossible either. I'm Robert Kim, and I've managed operations at Pine Valley Memorial Crematory for 13 years. My job requires attention to detail that borders on obsession, tracking everybody from intake to final disposition, ensuring proper documentation, and maintaining the kind of meticulous records that families and state regulators expect. In the cremation business, there's no room for error. Every signature, every timestamp, every procedural step must be accounted for. Monday mornings start with a comprehensive facility review. I check weekend logs, verify cold storage inventory, and review any scheduled services for the week ahead. Our weekend staff is minimal, just a security guard who makes rounds every 4 hours, so most operational activity waits for Monday. The building feels different after 2 days of relative silence, like it's been holding its breath and needs human activity to come back to life. Pine Valley operates with digital efficiency that would impress any corporate auditor. Our tracking system monitors every aspect of service delivery, from initial intake through final release of remains. Bodies are assigned unique identification numbers, logged into cold storage, and scheduled for cremation based on family preferences and facility capacity. Nothing happens without electronic documentation, which made Mrs. Patterson's situation so deeply disturbing. Eleanor Patterson had arrived Friday afternoon from Mercy General Hospital, another routine transfer of an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. The intake paperwork showed her assigned to Cold Storage Unit 7, with cremation scheduled for Tuesday morning per her family's request. Standard 3-day holding period, nothing unusual about the timing or arrangements. I remember the intake clearly, because Mrs. Patterson's daughter had called Friday evening to confirm our weekend security procedures. She seemed nervous about leaving her mother unattended over the weekend, asking detailed questions about our facility access and supervision protocols. I assured her that cold storage was secure and monitored, that her mother would receive the same careful attention we provided every family. When I arrived Monday morning, my first stop was always the cold storage area to verify weekend inventory against our digital records. 8 bodies had been logged in storage Friday evening. I counted 7. Mrs. Patterson was missing from Unit 7. I checked our weekend activity logs first, assuming someone had made an unscheduled pickup or transport. But the system showed no entries between Friday at 6 p.m. and Monday at 7 a.m. No staff access, no family visits, no emergency services. According to our records, the building had remained sealed and unoccupied for 62 hours. I called our weekend security guard, Miguel Santos, who insisted he'd completed all scheduled rounds without incident. Everything was normal, he said. Made my checks every 4 hours. Walked the whole building. Never saw anything unusual. All doors locked, no signs of entry or disturbance. I reviewed our security camera footage, which should have captured any movement in the cold storage area. The cameras showed Miguel's routine rounds, the empty hallways during overnight hours, and my own arrival Monday morning. No other human activity was recorded anywhere in the building. But Mrs. Patterson was gone. I expanded my search to include the cremation hall, thinking perhaps someone had moved her body in preparation for Tuesday's service. That's when I discovered something that made no sense at all. Retort number 2 showed recent use. The chamber was clean, properly cooled, and ready for operation exactly as it should appear after completing a cremation cycle. But according to our logs, no cremations had been scheduled or performed since Thursday afternoon. I checked the retort's digital monitoring system, which tracks every aspect of cremation operations. The logs showed a complete cycle performed Saturday evening, ignition at 8:47 p.m., full temperature reached by 9:15, cremation completed by 11:32, standard timing for an average-sized adult body. The system had even generated a completion report listing Mrs. Patterson as the deceased, with detailed temperature readings, cycle duration, and automatic shutdown procedures. Everything appeared normal except for one crucial detail. No human operator had initiated the process. I called our equipment manufacturer, but their technical support couldn't explain how a cremation cycle could complete without manual startup procedures. The retorts require multiple safety confirmations, key codes, and physical presence to activate. The system doesn't have any automated scheduling function. The technician explained. Someone had to physically operate that equipment. But our security footage showed no one in the cremation hall all weekend. I spent the morning reviewing every digital record related to Mrs. Patterson's case. Her intake documentation was complete and accurate. Her cold storage assignment had been properly logged. Her cremation completion report showed detailed technical data consistent with actual operation of retort number 2. Most disturbing of all, her remains had been processed and prepared for release. The cremated ash collection area contained a properly labeled container with Mrs. Patterson's identification number, cremation date, and processing notes. The container held approximately 4.5 pounds of bone, ash exactly what I'd expect from someone her size. The remains had been processed through our pulverizer, transferred to a temporary urn, and prepared according to her family specifications. Everything had been completed with professional precision, following our standard protocols exactly. I called Mrs. Patterson's daughter to explain the situation as carefully as possible. How do you tell someone that their mother's cremation was somehow completed by invisible hands, documented by systems that operated without human oversight? That's impossible, Linda Patterson said after a long silence. We specifically requested Tuesday cremation. We're having the memorial service Thursday. How could it be done already? I offered to delay the memorial service while we investigated, but Linda had a different concern. The cremation was completed Saturday evening? She asked. Around 11:30? Yes, according to our equipment logs. That's when she would have wanted it. Linda said quietly. Mom always said she preferred evening hours, when the world was quieter. She used to tell me she wanted to slip away when no one was watching too closely. After ending the call, I sat in my office trying to rationalize what had happened. Equipment malfunctions, security system glitches, human error, none of these explanations addressed the fundamental impossibility of the situation. A body had been removed from locked cold storage, cremated using equipment that required manual operation, and processed according to professional standards, all while the building remained empty and secured. That evening, I decided to review the weekend security footage more carefully, watching Miguel's rounds frame by frame, looking for any detail I might have missed. During his Saturday evening round, just before 9 p.m., I noticed something subtle in his behavior. When Miguel checked the cold storage area, he paused longer than usual at Unit 7. He stood very still for nearly a minute, head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Then he nodded once, almost respectfully, before continuing his rounds. I called Miguel that night and asked about the pause. You know, he said slowly, I did notice something Saturday evening. When I checked the cold storage, I heard this soft sound from Unit 7. Not mechanical noise, more like breathing, real slow and peaceful. I figured it was just the refrigeration system cycling, but for a moment it sounded almost like someone sleeping. Did you investigate? I looked through the window. Mrs. Patterson was lying there peaceful as could be, but I got this feeling that I shouldn't disturb her, you know? Like she was resting exactly where she wanted to be for just a little while longer. Miguel's next round was at midnight. The cold storage area was empty, and retort number 2 was beginning its cooling cycle after completion of cremation. I never found a logical explanation for Mrs. Patterson's unscheduled cremation. The equipment logs, the completed documentation, the processed remains very thing indicated a professional service completed according to protocol. But no human hands had operated the equipment. No staff member had initiated the process. 6 months later, I still think about that Saturday evening. About an elderly woman who'd spent her life preferring quiet hours and minimal attention, who somehow arranged her final transition exactly as she wanted it. About equipment that operated with impossible precision to honor preferences that were never officially documented. I've learned that some requests don't require human intervention to be fulfilled. Some arrangements transcend the paperwork we depend on, completing themselves when the time is right and the conditions are appropriate. Mrs. Patterson got her evening cremation in the quiet hours she preferred, and I've stopped trying to understand how. The crematory runs on schedules and protocols, but sometimes it runs on something deeper, the unstated wishes of those who trust us with their final care. I've made peace with processes I can't control or explain, because the alternative is questioning everything I think I know about the work we do here. Some services complete themselves, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. Fire consumes everything except what chooses not to burn. I'm Maria Santos, and I've been assisting with cremation operations at Sunset Memorial for 7 years. The work requires a particular kind of steadiness, handling death with respect while maintaining the technical precision that families deserve. Every body tells a story in how it responds to fire, and after 7 years, I've learned to read those stories. Some burn quickly, eager to transform. Others resist the process, clinging to physical form until the very end. But I've never encountered anyone like Eleanor Voss. The crematory operates on predictable rhythms. Bodies arrive, we prepare them with dignity, and the retort transforms flesh and bone into ash that families can hold, scatter, or enter according to their wishes. The process takes 3 to 4 hours for most people, depending on size and body composition. Physics governs the transformation. Organic matter breaks down at specific temperatures, calcium structures fragment into recoverable pieces, and what emerges bears no resemblance to the person who entered. Eleanor arrived on a Tuesday morning from Valley General Hospital, 84 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, 112 pounds. Death by complications from pneumonia, nothing unusual in her medical history. Her daughter requested our standard cremation package with a simple memorial service. Routine in every way that mattered for scheduling and preparation. I handled her intake personally, following our established protocols, with the same care I provided every family. Eleanor appeared exactly as I'd expect an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully, her expression serene, her hands folded naturally across her chest. There was something quietly dignified about her presentation, as if she'd prepared carefully for this transition. We scheduled her cremation for Wednesday morning, giving her family time to complete any final arrangements. Standard operating procedure called for 3 to 4 hours at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by processing and preparation of remains for pickup. I've performed this sequence hundreds of times without variation. Wednesday morning, I loaded Eleanor into retort number 1 and initiated the standard cycle. The chamber reached operating temperature within 30 minutes, and I monitored the process through our observation window. For the first hour, everything appeared normal, the expected chemical breakdown, the familiar progression of tissue reduction that I'd witnessed countless times before. But after 3 hours, when I opened the chamber to check completion status, Eleanor remained unchanged. Her body lay exactly as I'd positioned it, showing no signs of thermal damage, despite exposure to temperatures that should have reduced her to bone fragments. Her skin appeared unmarked, her hair unsinged, her clothing intact. She looked as if she'd simply been resting in a warm room rather than burning in a cremation chamber. I checked the retort's temperature readings, assuming equipment malfunction. The digital display confirmed sustained temperatures of 1800 degrees throughout the entire cycle. I tested the gas flow meters, examined the flame patterns, verified every system function. The equipment operated perfectly. I called my supervisor, David Chen, who'd managed crematory operations for 15 years. He arrived within an hour and conducted his own examination of Eleanor's unchanged body and our equipment readings. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted after reviewing the technical data. The retort functioned normally, reached proper temperatures, maintained consistent heat distribution. but she's completely unaffected. We decided to attempt a second cycle, thinking perhaps some unusual body chemistry or environmental factor had interfered with the initial process. I repositioned Eleanor in the chamber and restarted the cremation cycle, monitoring more closely this time. 4 hours later, she remained exactly the same. David contacted our equipment manufacturer, who suggested we were experiencing some kind of measurement error. Human tissue cannot withstand sustained cremation temperatures, the technician explained. There must be a problem with your monitoring systems. But our monitoring systems functioned perfectly, and Eleanor's preservation defied every principle of thermal reduction I understood. We tried a third cycle Thursday morning, then a fourth Friday afternoon. Each time, Eleanor emerged from the retort unchanged, as if fire simply refused to touch her. Her body showed no deterioration, no signs of heat exposure, no indication that she'd spent 16 hours burning at temperatures that should have vaporized her completely. By the following Monday, word had spread through our small staff. Eleanor Voss had become a puzzle that none of us could solve, a violation of natural law that challenged everything we thought we knew about cremation. Some of my colleagues began avoiding retort number 1, uncomfortable with the implications of a body that wouldn't burn. I found myself drawn to check on Eleanor during quiet moments, peering through the observation window at her serene expression. She looked peaceful, almost content, as if she were exactly where she wanted to be. There was something unsettling about her apparent satisfaction with the situation. Tuesday morning, I attempted the 5th cremation cycle. This time, I remained in the cremation hall throughout the entire process, watching through the observation window and monitoring equipment readings continuously. I wanted to understand what was happening, to witness whatever phenomenon was protecting Eleanor from thermal reduction. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual occurred. The retort burned normally, flames dancing around Eleanor's unchanged form. But during the 3rd hour, I began to notice something that made me question my own perception. Eleanor's eyes opened. Not suddenly or dramatically, but slowly and deliberately, as if she were waking from comfortable sleep. She turned her head slightly toward the observation window and looked directly at me through the flames. Her expression remained peaceful, but her gaze held an intensity that suggested complete awareness of her situation. I stepped back from the window, heart racing, but forced myself to continue watching. Eleanor's lips moved slightly, forming words I couldn't hear over the sound of burning gas. She seemed to be speaking to me, trying to communicate something important across the barrier of fire and steel. After several minutes, she closed her eyes again and returned to her original position. When the cycle completed 4 hours later, she appeared exactly as she had when I'd first placed her in the chamber 2 weeks earlier. That evening, I called Eleanor's daughter to explain our unusual situation as sensitively as possible. How do you tell someone that their mother's body refuses to burn, that cremation appears impossible despite perfect equipment and proper procedures? That sounds like Mom, Linda Voss said after a long pause. She never liked being rushed into anything, always said she'd do things in her own time, when she was ready. We can continue trying, I offered, but I'm not sure what else we can do. Don't worry about it, Linda replied. Mom will let you know when she's ready to go. She always did things her own way, and I don't expect death to change that. Wednesday morning, I prepared for the 6th cremation attempt with a mixture of professional determination and personal resignation. Eleanor had made her preferences clear through 2 weeks of impossible preservation. She wasn't ready to transform, and our equipment couldn't force her compliance. As I loaded her into the retort, I found myself speaking to her quietly. Mrs. Voss, your family understands if you need more time, but we're here when you're ready to move on. This time, I didn't monitor the process closely. Instead, I completed other tasks around the crematory, giving Eleanor privacy to make her own decision about when and how to proceed. Some transitions require patience, and I'd learned that force accomplished nothing in this situation. 4 hours later, I opened retort number 1 to find it empty except for a small pile of ash in the center of the chamber. Eleanor had finally completed her cremation, leaving behind the expected 5 pounds of bone fragments that I processed according to standard procedure. Her remains felt different in my hands lighter somehow, as if she'd retained only the essential elements and released everything unnecessary. When I transferred the ash to her temporary urn, I had the distinct impression that Eleanor was finally satisfied with her transformation. I still think about those 2 weeks when I'm working alone in the crematory, about a woman who understood that death, like life, happens on its own schedule, regardless of external pressure. About the patience required to honor processes that don't conform to technical manuals or professional expectations. Eleanor taught me that some transitions can't be forced, only facilitated when the time is right. She showed me that dignity sometimes means refusing to cooperate until conditions meet personal standards for completion. I handle every cremation with a little more patience now, knowing that some people need time to let go of life just as they needed time to live it fully. Some final wishes carry enough weight to change the weather. I'm Michael Foster, and I've operated cremation equipment at Riverside Memorial for 9 years. The work follows predictable pattern-scheduled services, routine maintenance, families who trust us to handle their most difficult transitions with dignity and care. Most requests are straightforward: specific timing, particular music, simple ceremonies that honor the deceased while comforting the living. But I'd never encountered a request like Arthur Henley's. The crematory scheduling system operates around practical considerations: equipment availability, staff scheduling, and family preferences that can be reasonably accommodated. We maintain consistent temperatures, follow established protocols, and complete services according to predetermined timelines. Weather rarely affects our operations, since everything happens indoors under controlled conditions. Arthur Henley's pre-need contract included an unusual specification that initially seemed like an elderly man's eccentricity. Under special instructions, he'd written in careful script, "Cremation must occur during active thunderstorm. Do not proceed without proper atmospheric conditions." His signature was firm and deliberate, suggesting this wasn't a casual request. When Mr. Henley passed in late September, his son Thomas called to discuss arrangements. Dad was very specific about the storm requirement. He explained, he grew up on a farm and always said thunder was nature's way of announcing transitions. He wants his cremation to happen when the sky is active. I explained that we couldn't control weather patterns or delay services indefinitely waiting for storms. Thomas seemed to understand the practical limitations, but remained firm about honoring his father's wishes. Just schedule it for the next time a storm is forecast, he suggested. Dad was patient about most things. The weather forecast for early October showed clear skies and mild temperatures, typical autumn conditions, with no storm systems approaching for at least a week. I scheduled Mr. Henley's cremation for the following Thursday, hoping a weather pattern might develop by then. Wednesday evening, the forecast remained unchanged. Sunny skies and calm conditions expected throughout the week. Thursday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and gentle breezes. No clouds, no humidity, no atmospheric pressure changes that might indicate developing storms. I called Thomas to discuss rescheduling, but he seemed unconcerned about the clear conditions. Just proceed as planned, he said. Dad had a way of making things happen when he needed them to. At 10 a.m., I prepared Mr. Henley's body for cremation according to standard procedures. The retort had been preheated and inspected, all safety systems checked and verified. Everything was ready for a routine service except for the complete absence of atmospheric activity that Mr. Henley had specifically requested. As I positioned his body in the cremation chamber, I noticed the building's air pressure seemed different, heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere were holding its breath. The sensation was subtle but persistent, like the moment before a weather front moves through. At 10:15, I initiated the cremation cycle. The retort's gas jets ignited with their familiar blue flame, and the chamber began heating toward operational temperature. Standard procedure called for gradual temperature increase over 30 minutes, followed by sustained burning for 3 to 4 hours. At 10:17, I heard the first rumble of thunder. I looked through the cremation hall windows and saw clear blue skies in every direction. No clouds, no wind, no visual indication of storm activity. But the thunder continued low, sustained rumbling that seemed to come from every direction at once, rather than a specific location in the sky. By 10:30, when the retort reached full cremation temperature, lightning began flashing outside despite the complete absence of storm clouds. Brilliant white strobes illuminated the building, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows and made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. The storm had materialized from nothing, defying every meteorological principle I understood. I called our local weather service to report the unusual conditions, but their radar showed no precipitation, no atmospheric disturbance, no storm system anywhere in our region. "You must be experiencing some kind of electrical interference," the meteorologist suggested. "Our instruments show completely clear conditions in your area." But the lightning continued, and the thunder grew more intense as Mr. Henley's cremation progressed. Around noon, Thomas Henley called to check on the service. "I hear you got your storm," he said, and I could hear satisfaction in his voice. Dad always was good at timing. "How did you know about the storm?" I asked. "The weather service shows clear conditions." "Dad's storms don't always show up on radar," Thomas replied. "They're more personal, family events, you might say." Through the afternoon, the impossible storm continued. Lightning struck continuously around the building, illuminating the crematory with strobing white light that made everything feel surreal and charged with energy. The thunder maintained a steady rhythm that seemed synchronized with the retort's operation, as if the storm were somehow connected to Mr. Henley's transformation. By 3 p.m., when the cremation cycle completed, the atmospheric activity had intensified beyond anything I'd experienced. Lightning struck the building's lightning rods repeatedly, sending electrical surges through our grounding systems. The air itself felt alive with static electricity that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. As I began the cooling process for the retort, something extraordinary happened. A massive lightning bolt struck directly above the cremation hall, illuminating the entire building with brilliant white light that lasted several seconds longer than any normal electrical discharge. In that extended moment of illumination, I saw something through the observation window that made me step back in amazement. Mr. Henley's body was gone, but the chamber was filled with dancing threads of light electric filaments that swirled and pulsed in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The light threads moved with purpose, gathering and dispersing in waves that reminded me of aurora displays, but contained within the confined space of the cremation chamber. The electrical display continued for several minutes, creating patterns of incredible beauty and complexity. I watched, transfixed, as the light threads gradually condensed into a more concentrated form, then slowly faded to reveal the expected pile of bone ash where Mr. Henley's body had been. When the light show ended, the storm stopped immediately. The thunder ceased, the lightning ended, and the oppressive atmospheric pressure lifted as if someone had opened an enormous window. Within minutes, the building returned to its normal, quiet operation. An afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that had been strobing with electrical activity moments before. I processed Mr. Henley's remains according to standard procedure, but the bone ash felt different, lighter, and somehow more energetic than typical cremated remains. When I transferred the ash to its temporary container, I noticed faint traces of electrical activity still sparking between the particles, like static electricity that hadn't completely dissipated. Thomas Henley picked up his father's remains the next morning. "Dad always said he wanted to go out with some fireworks," he mentioned casually. "Sounds like he got his wish." "Have you experienced anything like this before?" I asked. "Dad's father went the same way," Thomas said. "And his grandfather. Family tradition, you might say. We've learned to respect the atmospheric requirements." After Thomas left, I spent time researching historical weather patterns around previous Henley family cremations. The records were incomplete, but I found references to unusual electrical activity and localized storm phenomena associated with several services over the past 50 years. It seemed the Henley family had developed some kind of relationship with atmospheric forces that extended beyond normal meteorological understanding. I still work at Riverside Memorial, and I've completed hundreds of cremations since Mr. Henley's service. Most follow the predictable patterns I've come to. Expect routine procedures that honor the deceased while providing closure for families. The work remains meaningful and important, regardless of how straightforward or complex the requests might be. But sometimes, when I'm preparing for a service and the atmospheric pressure feels heavy with possibility, I think about Arthur Henley and his impossible storm. About the way some people carry enough energy to bend natural forces to their will, even in death. About final requests that transcend practical limitations and create their own conditions for fulfillment. I've learned that some transitions require more than human engineering can provide. Some departures need the kind of dramatic accompaniment that only nature can supply, summoned by forces I don't pretend to understand, but have learned to respect. Dead hands don't speak, but sometimes they try anyway. I'm Anna Lou, and I've worked cremation operations at Mercy Memorial for 6 years. The observation window is part of my daily routine, a small porthole of heat-resistant glass that allows us to monitor cremation progress without opening the chamber. Most families never see this part of the process, and that's probably for the best. What happens during the first hour of cremation can be unsettling for those who don't understand the science behind thermal reduction. Bodies move during cremation. Muscle contractions, tendon tightening, and thermal expansion cause what we call pugilistic postures. Arms drawing up, fingers curling, heads turning slightly. It's all perfectly normal, explained by basic physiology and the effects of extreme heat on human tissue. After 6 years, I've seen every possible variation of these postmortem movements. The crematory operates with clockwork precision. Bodies arrive, we prepare them with dignity, and the retort transforms flesh and bone according to predictable physical laws. I monitor each cremation through the observation window, checking temperature gauges and ensuring proper combustion. The work requires technical attention combined with respectful awareness that we're handling someone's final transition. Mrs. Dorothy Caldwell arrived on a Wednesday morning from Riverside Hospital. 79 years old, passed peacefully after a brief illness. Her granddaughter had chosen our standard cremation package with a private family service. Nothing unusual about the arrangements or her presentation. A small elderly woman who appeared to have died comfortably in her sleep. I prepared Mrs. Caldwell according to our established protocols and scheduled her cremation for Thursday afternoon. The retort had been cleaned and inspected, all safety systems verified, temperature controls calibrated, everything ready for a routine service that should complete in 3.5 hours. Thursday at 2 p.m., I positioned Mrs. Caldwell in the cremation chamber and initiated the heating cycle. The retort gradually increased temperature over 30 minutes, reaching the 1800 degrees Fahrenheit required for proper reduction. I monitored the process through the observation window, watching for any irregularities that might require adjustment. For the first 40 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Mrs. Caldwell's body responded to heat exactly as I'd expect. Gradual changes in tissue consistency, the beginning of thermal breakdown, minor shifts in position as tendons contracted. Standard physiological responses that I'd witnessed hundreds of times before. Then her hands began to move. Initially, I assumed I was seeing normal muscle contractions. Her fingers curled slowly inward, a typical reaction to heat exposure that happens to most bodies during early cremation phases. But as I continued watching, the movements seemed more deliberate than random physiological responses. Mrs. Caldwell's right hand opened and closed repeatedly, 5 distinct cycles over the course of several minutes. Then her left hand began the same pattern, opening, closing, with mechanical precision that suggested intention rather than involuntary muscle response. I checked the retort's temperature readings, thinking perhaps uneven heating was causing unusual muscle activity. The chamber maintained consistent temperature throughout, with no hot spots or thermal irregularities that might explain the repetitive hand movements. As the cremation progressed into its second hour, Mrs. Caldwell's hands continued their deliberate patterns. Both hands now moved in synchronized sequence 5 cycles of opening and closing, followed by 3 tapping motions against the chamber floor, then a pause before repeating the entire sequence. I called my supervisor, Janet Morrison, who'd managed crematory operations for 12 years. She arrived within 20 minutes and observed Mrs. Caldwell's movements through the observation window. "I've never seen anything like that," Janet admitted, after watching several complete cycles. "The timing is too consistent for random muscle contractions. It's almost like she's trying to tell us something," I finished. We stood together at the observation window, watching Mrs. Caldwell's hands repeat their pattern with unwavering precision. 5 open-close cycles, 3 taps, pause, repeat. The sequence continued for another 30 minutes before the advancing heat finally stilled her movements permanently. After the cremation completed and the chamber cooled, I processed Mrs. Caldwell's remains according to standard procedure. But I couldn't stop thinking about those hand movements, the deliberate timing, the consistent pattern, the impression of urgency in her repetitive gestures. That evening, I researched Mrs. Caldwell's background, trying to understand if her profession or interests might explain the specific hand movements I'd witnessed. Her obituary mentioned 40 years as an elementary school teacher, volunteer work with literacy programs, and a passion for helping children with learning disabilities. A detail in the obituary caught my attention. Dorothy was beloved for her patience in teaching sign language to hearing impaired students, often staying after school to provide additional support. Sign language. I spent hours that night researching basic sign language symbols, comparing my memory of Mrs. Caldwell's movements to standard gestural communications. The 5 open-close hand cycles seemed to correspond to the number 5. The 3 tapping motions might represent the number 3. 5, 3, 53. I called Mrs. Caldwell's granddaughter the next morning, asking carefully about any significance the numbers 5 and 3 might have held for her grandmother. "Room 53, Sarah Caldwell said immediately. "That was Grandma's first classroom, when she started teaching in 1967. She always said it was where she learned to really communicate with students who needed extra help. Why do you ask?" I explained about the hand movements I'd observed, describing them as unusual muscle contractions that seemed to follow a specific pattern. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Grandma had a stroke 3 weeks before she died," Sarah finally said. "It affected her speech, but she kept trying to sign even when she couldn't talk clearly. She kept signing 53 over and over, like she was trying to tell us something important about that classroom." "Did you ever find out what she meant?" "We cleaned out her apartment after the funeral and found a box of letters in her closet, love letters from our grandfather, written when he was stationed overseas during the Korean War. She'd hidden them for 60 years because she thought the family wouldn't approve of some of the things he'd written." Sarah paused, her voice becoming softer. The box was labeled Room 50, her way of keeping the letters connected to where she'd learned to communicate without words. "I think she was trying to tell us where to find them, to make sure we knew how much they'd loved each other." After ending the call, I sat in my office, thinking about Mrs. Caldwell's final communication. About a woman who'd spent her career teaching children to express themselves when words weren't enough, who'd used her last moments to guide her family toward hidden expressions of love. The observation window had shown me something beyond normal physiological responses to cremation. I'd witnessed a final lesson from a teacher who understood that communication transcends physical limitations, that some messages are important enough to survive even the complete destruction of the body that creates them. I still monitor every cremation through the observation window, watching for the normal muscle contractions and thermal responses that characterize the reduction process. But I pay closer attention now to movements that seem deliberate, to patterns that might represent final attempts at communication from people who dedicated their lives to helping others express themselves. Mrs. Caldwell taught me that death doesn't always end the desire to teach, to guide, to share one last lesson with those who are willing to watch and learn. Sometimes the most important communications happen in the final moments, delivered through gestures that speak louder than words ever could. Numbers don't lie, but they sometimes count things that shouldn't exist. I'm James Morrison, and I've maintained cremation records at Westside Memorial for 14 years. My work requires absolute precision, tracking every body from intake through final disposition, matching service records with supply consumption, and ensuring our documentation satisfies both family needs and state regulatory requirements. In 14 years, my books have never been off by so much as a single cremation container. Until this year, the crematory operates on meticulous inventory management. Every cremation consumes specific quantities of natural gas, cremation containers, and processing materials. I track these supplies daily, cross-referencing consumption with completed services to maintain accurate cost accounting. Our vendors deliver on precise schedules, and I monitor usage patterns to predict supply needs weeks in advance. Record keeping in the death care industry demands exceptional attention to detail. Families trust us with their most precious loss, and regulatory agencies require comprehensive documentation of every aspect of our operations. My filing system tracks intake manifests, cremation completion reports, and final disposition records with redundant verification at multiple stages. Each December, I perform a comprehensive annual audit, reconciling service records with supply consumption to prepare reports for our corporate office. The mathematics are straightforward. Total cremations should equal total supply usage within predictable parameters. Fuel consumption varies slightly based on body size and composition, but the variations fall within established ranges. This year's audit revealed an impossible discrepancy. Our cremation log showed 847 completed services from January through November. I'd personally verified each entry, cross-checked intake records with completion reports, and confirmed that every documented cremation corresponded to an actual family who'd received services. The count was accurate and complete. But our supply records indicated consumption for 848 cremations. I rechecked the calculations multiple times, thinking I'd made an arithmetic error. The numbers remained consistent. We'd used exactly enough natural gas, cremation containers, and processing materials for one additional service beyond what our official records documented. One extra cremation that had somehow been completed without generating any paperwork. I reviewed our inventory logs month by month, looking for patterns that might explain the discrepancy. Gas consumption showed steady increases corresponding to documented services, with no unusual spikes or irregular usage that might indicate equipment malfunction or theft. The missing cremation seemed to have occurred gradually over the entire year, as if someone had been using our facility in small increments that wouldn't trigger immediate notice. I called our fuel supplier to verify delivery records. Their documentation matched our consumption logs exactly. We'd used sufficient gas for 848 standard cremations. I contacted our container vendor with similar results. Every supply category showed consistent overuse of approximately one complete cremation. My supervisor, Director Susan Chen, reviewed my findings with the same methodical approach I'd applied to the original audit. "There has to be a logical explanation," she said after verifying my calculations. "Equipment doesn't operate without generating records." But our equipment logs showed only documented cremations. Every ignition cycle, every temperature reading, every completion report corresponded to official services in our system. No additional retort usage appeared in any technical documentation. I expanded my investigation to include security records, thinking perhaps unauthorized access might explain the supply discrepancy. Our building maintains comprehensive surveillance and electronic access controls that log every entry and exit. The security system showed no unusual activity, no after-hours access, no evidence of unauthorized facility use. Week by week, I traced supply consumption against documented services, looking for the point where the discrepancy began. The pattern emerged slowly, consistent, slight overuse beginning in January and continuing through November, as if someone had been conducting one cremation every 4 to 5 months without generating any official documentation. I reviewed our intake records for possible data entry errors or missed documentation. Every body that entered our facility had corresponding completion records and family notification. No intake had been processed without full documentation, and no family had been charged for services we couldn't account for in our official logs. The missing cremation appeared to involve someone who'd never officially entered our system. Director Chen suggested we conduct a complete facility inspection, checking for hidden storage areas or unauthorized equipment that might explain the mysterious supply usage. We examined every room, every storage area, every piece of equipment for signs of undocumented activity. In the basement storage area, behind our archive filing cabinets, I discovered something that made the discrepancy more disturbing. A small collection of ash scattered on the concrete floor, maybe 2 or 3 ounces total, the kind of residue that might remain after incomplete cleanup of cremated remains. The ash wasn't concentrated in one location, but distributed in a rough human outline, as if someone had been lying on the floor and gradually dispersed into particles. I collected samples for analysis while Director Chen documented the discovery with photographs. The ash appeared consistent with cremated human remains, but we had no record of any processing or cleanup activity in that area. Laboratory analysis confirmed the samples contained calcium phosphate and trace minerals typical of human bone ash. Carbon dating suggested the remains were recent, probably within the past 12 months. But the analysis couldn't identify who the ash had belonged to or when the cremation might have occurred. I spent the following week reviewing security footage from the basement storage area, looking for any activity that might explain the scattered remains. The cameras showed routine archive access and maintenance visits, but no evidence of body storage or cremation residue disposal. The ash had appeared without any documented human activity in that area. Director Chen contacted our corporate security team, who conducted their own investigation into the supply discrepancy and mysterious ash discovery. Their audit confirmed my findings: 848 cremations worth of supply consumption, 847 documented services, and no explanation for the difference. This suggests someone has been using your facility for unauthorized cremations, the security investigator concluded, but we can't find any evidence of how they gained access or when the activity occurred. 3 weeks later, I was working late, completing year-end reports, when I noticed something unusual in the basement storage area. The scattered ash pattern had changed, not removed, but rearranged into a more concentrated formation near the back wall. I hadn't disturbed the area since collecting samples, and security footage showed no other human activity in that location. The ash was moving on its own. Over the following nights, I monitored the storage area more carefully, checking the ash pattern each evening before leaving. The particles continued shifting position gradually, forming different configurations that seemed almost intentional circles, lines, patterns that suggested organization rather than random dispersal. By December 15th, the ash had arranged itself into recognizable letters: "Thank you." I stood in the storage area reading the message, understanding finally that our facility had been providing service to someone who couldn't officially request it. Someone who'd found a way to use our equipment and supplies without appearing in any documentation system. Someone who'd been grateful for the service. I never reported the ash message to Director Chen or corporate security. Instead, I swept up the remains and disposed of them according to our standard procedures for handling cremated human ash. The supply discrepancy remained in our official records as an unexplained variance, but I stopped investigating. I've learned that some services transcend official documentation. Some cremations serve needs that can't be recorded in manifests or tracked through regulatory systems. Our facility had been used by someone who required final dignity but couldn't navigate normal channels to receive it. I still maintain precise records of every documented cremation, but I've accepted that my books might occasionally account for services that exist beyond the paperwork I keep so carefully. Some final transitions happen in the spaces between official procedures, completed by processes I don't fully understand but have learned to respect. Heat follows the laws of physics, except when it encounters something stronger than fire. I'm Carol Reeves, and I've been chief technician at Riverside Memorial Crematory for 18 years. In that time, I've supervised over 4,000 cremations and understand thermal reduction with the precision of someone who's watched fire transform flesh and bone into ash thousands of times. Temperature is everything in cremation too low, and reduction is incomplete. Too high and equipment suffers damage. The process operates within narrow parameters that I monitor religiously. Retort thermometers are calibrated instruments designed to withstand extreme heat while providing accurate readings throughout the cremation cycle. Our digital temperature monitoring system tracks thermal progression in real time, logging data that helps me optimize each service for complete reduction while protecting expensive equipment from damage. Normal cremation temperatures range from 1600 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, thought enough to break down organic tissue while staying within safe operational limits for our steel and ceramic chamber construction. I've never recorded readings above 1900 degrees, and our equipment manufacturer warns that sustained temperatures above 2000 degrees could cause structural damage to the retort itself. Mr. Charles Garrison arrived on a Tuesday morning from Metropolitan Hospital. 68 years old, retired metallurgist, death by natural causes, following a brief illness. His daughter requested our standard cremation package with no special requirements or unusual requests. Everything appeared routine when I reviewed his intake paperwork and scheduled his service for Wednesday afternoon. I prepared Mr. Garrison according to established protocols, following the same procedures I'd performed thousands of times. He was average height and weight, with no medical devices or unusual characteristics that might affect the cremation process. His body showed the peaceful expression of someone who died comfortably, without distress or struggle. Wednesday at 2 p.m., I positioned Mr. Garrison in retort number 2 and initiated the standard heating cycle. The chamber began its gradual temperature increase, reaching operational levels within 30 minutes as expected. I monitored the thermometer readings from my control station, watching for the steady progression that indicates proper combustion. The temperature climbed normally for the first hour, 1600 degrees, 1700, 1800, standard thermal progression that I'd witnessed countless times before. But as the cycle continued into its second hour, the readings began climbing beyond normal parameters. 1900 degrees, 2000, 2100. I checked the thermometer calibration, assuming instrument malfunction, but secondary temperature sensors confirmed the impossible readings. The retort was reaching thermal levels that should have damaged our equipment and compromised chamber integrity. At 2200 degrees, I began emergency shutdown procedures. Temperatures this extreme posed serious risks to our facility's structural safety and could cause catastrophic equipment failure. But the retort's cooling system seemed unable to reduce the thermal output. The readings continued climbing despite my attempts to control them. 2300 degrees, 2400, 2500. The chamber was generating more heat than our fuel systems could possibly produce, reaching temperatures that belonged in industrial furnaces designed for metal processing rather than human cremation. I called our equipment manufacturer's emergency service line, describing readings that the technician said were physically impossible. "Your retort can't reach those temperatures," he insisted. "The fuel mixture and chamber design have built-in limits. You must be experiencing instrument failure." But multiple sensors confirmed the readings, and the heat radiating from the chamber was intense enough to feel from across the room. At the 3-hour mark, when normal cremation should have been complete, the thermometer peaked at 2700 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures that would melt copper and severely damage steel construction. The retort should have been destroyed by heat this extreme, yet somehow the chamber remained structurally intact. I initiated emergency cooling procedures and waited for the chamber to reach safe levels for inspection. The temperature dropped gradually over the next 2 hours, but the thermal reduction seemed resistant to normal cooling processes, as if some internal heat source continued generating energy independent of our fuel systems. When the retort finally cooled enough for safe opening, I prepared to inspect what I assumed would be severely damaged equipment and perhaps some unusual ash pattern resulting from the extreme temperatures. Instead, I found Mr. Garrison lying exactly as I'd positioned him 6 hours earlier. His body showed no signs of thermal damage despite exposure to temperatures that should have vaporized organic tissue within minutes. His skin appeared unmarked, his hair unsinged, his clothing intact. He looked as if he'd simply been resting in a warm room rather than enduring heat intense enough to melt metal. I called my supervisor, Director Patricia Wong, who arrived within an hour to inspect the impossible scene. Mr. Garrison's unchanged body, the undamaged retort interior, and the documented temperature readings that violated every principle of thermal physics we understood. "This can't be right," Director Wong said, after reviewing the data logs. "Either the thermometers malfunctioned or something protected his body from heat that should have destroyed everything in that chamber." We tested our temperature monitoring systems extensively, checking calibration and comparing readings across multiple instruments. Every sensor functioned perfectly, confirming that the retort had indeed reached temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees. I researched Mr. Garrison's background, looking for any explanation of his apparent immunity to extreme heat. His career as a metallurgist involved working with high-temperature processes, but nothing in his professional experience suggested personal protection from thermal damage. His daughter mentioned that he'd spent the last months of his life working on what he called thermal resistance research, experiments with materials that could withstand extreme heat without structural damage. She didn't understand the technical details, but said he'd been excited about a breakthrough he'd achieved just weeks before his death. "Dad always said heat was just another element to be understood and controlled," she told me. "He spent his whole career learning how materials respond to temperature extremes." I attempted a second cremation cycle the following day, monitoring Mr. Garrison's response to normal cremation temperatures. This time, I maintained standard thermal levels between 17 and 1800 degrees, avoiding the extreme heat that had characterized the previous attempt. Mr. Garrison's body remained unchanged after 4 hours of normal cremation temperatures. Director Wong contacted our corporate office, which sent a technical team to investigate the situation. They performed comprehensive equipment testing, thermal analysis of Mr. Garrison's body, and detailed examination of every aspect of our cremation procedures. The investigation confirmed that our equipment functioned normally and that Mr. Garrison's body exhibited no unusual chemical or physical properties that might explain his resistance to cremation. Yet he remained unaffected by temperatures that should have reduced him to ash. On the third attempt, something different happened. As the retort reached normal operating temperature, Mr. Garrison's body began to glow with soft, steady light that seemed to emanate from within his tissue. The glow intensified as temperatures climbed, creating an aura of luminescence that filled the chamber with gentle radiance. The temperature readings remained normal throughout this cycle, but the light continued for the entire cremation period. When I opened the chamber after cooling, I found Mr. Garrison had finally completed his transformation, reduced to the expected ash, but ash that maintained a faint, luminescent quality for several hours after processing. I processed his remains according to standard procedure, though the ash felt different from normal cremated remains warmer, somehow more energetic, as if it retained thermal properties that normal bone ash didn't possess. Mr. Garrison's family collected his remains the following week, commenting on the unusual warmth of the container even days after cremation. "Dad always ran hot," his daughter said. "It makes sense that he'd stay warm even now." I still monitor cremation temperatures with the same precision I've maintained for 18 years, but I've learned that some people carry properties that transcend normal thermal physics. Some individuals develop resistances or adaptations that operate beyond the scientific principles I thought governed all cremation processes. Mr. Garrison showed me that heat is indeed just another element to be understood and controlled, and that some people spend their final years learning to master forces that most of us never imagined we could influence. His thermal resistance research apparently succeeded in ways that conventional science couldn't measure or explain. I handle every cremation with respect for processes I may not fully understand, knowing that some transformations happen according to principles that exist beyond the temperature readings I monitor so carefully. Flowing water is supposed to carry things away, not bring them back. I'm Luis Rodriguez, and I've coordinated family services at Pine Ridge Memorial for 12 years. Part of my job involves helping families plan ash scattering, ceremonies guiding them through the emotional process of final release, ensuring they understand local regulations, and providing the support they need during one of grief's most difficult moments. Most scatterings proceed exactly as families expect, a meaningful ceremony followed by the peaceful knowledge that their loved one has been returned to nature. But Millfield Creek seems to operate by different rules. Memorial services require careful attention to both practical and emotional details. Families often choose scattering locations that held special meaning for the deceased favorite hiking trails, childhood swimming holes, or scenic overlooks where they found peace during life. I help coordinate logistics, obtain necessary permits, and ensure ceremonies proceed with dignity appropriate to the occasion. Millfield Creek flows through the wooded area behind our cemetery, a gentle waterway that's been popular with families for years. The creek maintains year-round flow, creating the kind of peaceful setting that comforts grieving relatives. Local regulations permit ash scattering in the creek with proper notification, and the flowing water provides natural dispersal that families find emotionally satisfying. I've coordinated dozens of scatterings at Millfield Creek without any unusual incidents. Families arrive with urns containing their loved ones' ashes. We conduct brief ceremonies according to their wishes, and they scatter the remains in the flowing water. The ashes disperse quickly in the current, providing visual confirmation that the release has been completed successfully. The Henderson family was the first to report something unusual. Margaret Henderson had requested creek scattering in her pre-need arrangements, specifying that her ashes should be scattered where the creek bends around the old oak tree. Her daughter Sarah called me 2 days after their ceremony, sounding confused and upset. "Mr. Rodriguez, there's something wrong with Mom's urn," she said. "We scattered her ashes Sunday afternoon, just like we planned. But when I got home, the urn was full again. It's got the same weight, the same ash, everything exactly like before the ceremony. I assumed she'd brought the wrong container to the creek, perhaps a decorative urn, while the actual ashes remained at home. But Sarah insisted they'd used the correct urn, that she'd personally poured her mother's ashes into the flowing water and watched them disperse in the current. I don't understand how this is possible," she continued. "We definitely scattered the ashes. Everyone in the family saw it happen, but somehow they're back in the urn." I offered to meet with Sarah to examine the situation, thinking there might be a simple explanation for her confusion. Grief affects perception, and families sometimes misremember details of emotionally charged ceremonies. But when Sarah brought the urn to my office, it contained exactly the amount of ash we'd processed from Margaret Henderson's cremation. I weighed the contents and compared them to our original processing records. The quantity matched exactly 4 3/4 pounds of bone ash, precisely what Margaret's cremation had produced. 2 weeks later, the Kowalski family reported an identical situation. They'd scattered their father's ashes at Millfield Creek, watched the remains disperse in the water, then discovered the urn full again when they returned home. Like the Hendersons, they insisted the scattering had been completed successfully, with multiple family members witnessing the ash dispersal. I began to suspect some kind of substitution or mix-up in our procedures. Perhaps families were accidentally bringing decorative urns while the actual ashes remained in our facility. But our records showed both the Henderson and Kowalski cremations had been released to families with proper documentation. The third incident occurred with the Chen family in November. David Chen called me the morning after their creek ceremony, describing exactly the same situation: successful ash scattering, followed by mysterious restoration of the urn's contents. "We were very careful about the ceremony," David explained. "We wanted to make sure Dad's ashes were properly dispersed, so we scattered them slowly, in small portions over several minutes. We watched every handful disappear into the water, but the urn is full again, like we never touched it. I decided to observe the next Millfield Creek ceremony personally, to understand what might be causing these impossible restorations. The Morrison family had scheduled their mother's scattering for the following Saturday, and I asked permission to attend as a witness to the proceedings. Saturday morning, I met the Morrison family at the creek bend, where their mother had requested her ashes be scattered. The ceremony preceded normally brief readings, shared memories, and careful dispersal of the cremated remains into the flowing water. I watched closely as family members poured ash from the urn, seeing the gray particles spread across the creek's surface before sinking into the current. The urn was definitely empty when the ceremony concluded. I verified this myself, looking inside the container and confirming no ash remained. The Morrison family seemed satisfied with the peaceful ceremony and the knowledge that their mother had been returned to the natural setting she loved. 3 hours later, Mrs. Morrison called to report that the urn was full again. I drove immediately to the Morrison home and examined the urn personally. It contained the same 4½ pounds of ash that their mother's cremation had produced, as if the scattering ceremony had never occurred. That evening, I returned to Millfield Creek alone to investigate the scattering site. I walked along the creek bed, looking for any sign of the ash that should have settled in the water or along the banks. The creek flowed normally, with no visible residue from the morning's ceremony. But as I searched the area around the old oak tree, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the situation completely. Beneath the surface of the water, in the deep pool where families typically scattered ashes, I could see layers of sediment that didn't match the creek's natural composition. Gray deposits that looked exactly like cremated remains, but compressed into distinct strata that suggested multiple scatterings over time. The creek wasn't dispersing the ashes, it was collecting them. I collected water samples from the scattering area and submitted them for analysis. The laboratory confirmed high concentrations of calcium phosphate and other minerals consistent with cremated human remains. The creek contained enough ash residue to account for dozens of scatterings over many years. But this still didn't explain how empty urns became full again after successful scattering ceremonies. I researched Millfield Creek's history and discovered that the waterway had been used for ash scattering since the 1940s, when our cemetery first opened. Hundreds of families had chosen the creek for final disposition of their loved ones' remains, drawn by its peaceful setting and continuous flow. What I couldn't find was any record of families reporting restored urns before this year. The pattern continued through the winter. Every family who scattered ashes at Millfield Creek reported the same impossible restoration urns that became full again despite successful dispersal ceremonies. I began recommending alternative scattering locations, but some families insisted on using the creek despite my warnings about the unusual incidents. In February, I decided to conduct a controlled experiment. I brought a small container of ash from our facility's test samples and scattered it at Millfield Creek while documenting the entire process with photographs and video. The ash dispersed normally in the flowing water, exactly as expected. When I returned to my office, the container was full again. The video footage showed clear evidence of ash dispersal, but somehow the material had been restored to its original container despite physical documentation of its release into the flowing water. I consulted with our facilities director about the situation, but she had no explanation for the impossible restorations. Maybe the families find comfort in having the ashes back, she suggested. Perhaps it's better not to question something that seems to ease their grief. But the families weren't finding comfort. They were confused and disturbed by the inexplicable return of remains they'd carefully scattered according to their loved ones' wishes. I began accompanying families to Millfield Creek ceremonies, explaining that the creek had unusual properties that might result in ash restoration. Most families accepted this information with curiosity rather than alarm, viewing it as a final gift from their loved ones rather than something to fear. "Mom always said she'd find a way to stay close to us," one daughter said after discovering her mother's ashes had returned. "Maybe this is her way of keeping that promise." I've stopped trying to understand how Millfield Creek restores scattered ashes to their original containers. The process violates physical laws, I thought, governed matter and movement. but it provides families with something unexpected: the option to keep their loved one's remains while still honoring their wishes for natural dispersal. Some places refuse to accept what they're given, returning gifts with interest. Millfield Creek has become a location where scattering and keeping coexist, where final release doesn't require permanent separation. I coordinate ceremonies there with respect for processes I can't explain but have learned to accept as part of the complex relationship between death, memory, and the places we choose for goodbye. Clean equipment doesn't need cleaning, unless something refuses to let go. I'm Rita Walsh, and I've supervised crematory equipment maintenance at Valley Memorial for 16 years. My job requires understanding the mechanical systems that make dignified cremation possible: monitoring retort performance, scheduling preventive maintenance, and ensuring every component operates at peak efficiency. Clean equipment is essential equipment, and I maintain detailed logs of every cleaning cycle, every inspection, every repair that keeps our facility running smoothly. Cremation chambers are designed to run clean. Proper combustion at correct temperatures reduces organic matter to ash with minimal residue, leaving chambers that require only routine maintenance between services. Our retorts have automated cleaning systems that activate when manual cycles are initiated, but they're not programmed for independent operation. Equipment doesn't clean itself without human instruction. The crematory operates on predictable maintenance schedules that I've refined over 16 years of experience. Daily visual inspections, weekly system tests, monthly deep cleaning cycles, and quarterly comprehensive overhauls. Every maintenance activity is logged, documented, and tracked to ensure optimal performance and regulatory compliance. Frank Delacroix was cremated on a Thursday afternoon in October. 62 years old, homeless for the past decade. Death by exposure during an early cold snap. The county arranged cremation through our Indigent Services Program. Basic reduction with minimal ceremony, ashes to be held for 30 days before disposition in our memorial garden. Frank had no family, no friends, no visitors during his final transition. The county social worker who delivered his paperwork mentioned that he'd been a loner for years, avoiding shelters and services, preferring solitude even when weather threatened his survival. His cremation proceeded without ceremony or witness, just another quiet service for someone who died alone. Friday morning, I discovered something unusual in the maintenance logs. Retort number 3 showed an automated cleaning cycle had activated at 11 p.m. Thursday night, approximately 6 hours after Frank's cremation had completed. I checked the retort's programming, assuming someone had accidentally triggered the cleaning system. But the automated cycle wasn't manually initiated and didn't correspond to any scheduled maintenance. The system had activated independently, running for exactly 7 minutes before shutting down. The cleaning cycle had removed residue that shouldn't have existed in a properly functioning chamber. I examined retort number 3 personally, looking for evidence of the cleaning activity. The chamber appeared spotless, but I noticed unusual wear patterns on the cleaning mechanisms, if they'd been working harder than normal to remove stubborn deposits. Our cleaning systems use high-pressure steam and specialized solvents to remove any residue that accumulates during cremation. But modern retorts run so efficiently that minimal residue should remain after proper combustion. The cleaning cycle suggested significant buildup that required aggressive removal. I reviewed the technical data from Frank's cremation, looking for anomalies that might explain excess residue formation. Temperature readings, combustion efficiency, timing, parameters, everything appeared normal. His cremation had completed, according to standard specifications, with no unusual characteristics. Yet something had required 7 minutes of intensive cleaning. Saturday morning brought another surprise. The maintenance logs showed retort number 3 had activated its cleaning cycle again at 11 p.m. Friday night. Same duration, same intensity, same mysterious residue removal from a chamber that should have been clean. I called our equipment manufacturer to report the unusual automated cycles. The technician insisted that independent cleaning activation was impossible without manual initiation. The system doesn't have timer functions or autonomous operation capabilities, he explained. Someone must be triggering the cycles manually. But our facility was locked and empty at 11 p.m., with no staff present to initiate cleaning procedures. I installed motion sensors in the cremation hall, thinking perhaps unauthorized access might explain the cleaning cycles. The sensors would detect any human presence that might trigger equipment operation during overnight hours. Sunday morning, the motion sensors showed no activity between closing time and my Monday morning arrival. But retort number 3 had cleaned itself again at 11 p.m. Saturday, removing residue that continued to accumulate despite the chamber's apparent cleanliness. I decided to remain at the facility Sunday evening to observe the 11 p.m. cleaning cycle personally. If someone was secretly operating our equipment, I wanted to identify them and understand their purpose. At 10:30 p.m., I positioned myself in the cremation hall with clear view of retort number 3 and all access points. The building was completely quiet, with only the hum of refrigeration units and air filtration systems breaking the silence. At 10:58, I heard the first sound, a soft whisper of air movement that seemed to come from inside retort number 3 itself. Not mechanical noise from fans or motors, but something that sounded almost like breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation from within the sealed chamber. At 11 p.m. exactly, the cleaning cycle activated. High-pressure steam hissed through the cleaning nozzles, solvent sprayed across chamber surfaces, and mechanical brushes scrubbed with intensive motion. But through the observation window, I could see something that made me step closer for a better view. The cleaning system was working around something that shouldn't have been there. Steam and solvents flowed around a vague outline in the center of the chambera shape that suggested human form but appeared translucent, like heat distortion, visible only when contrasted against the cleaning sprays. The mechanical brushes moved carefully around this shape, avoiding direct contact while thoroughly cleaning the surrounding surfaces. The outline remained motionless during the cleaning cycle, but I had the distinct impression of someone lying peacefully while maintenance proceeded around them. The cleaning system operated with unusual precision, as if programmed to avoid disturbing the chamber's invisible occupant. At 11:07, the cleaning cycle completed and the equipment shut down. The translucent outline faded gradually, disappearing completely within minutes of the cycle's end. I checked the chamber after cooling, finding it spotless as always. No trace of the figure I'd observed, no evidence of any presence that might explain the cleaning system's careful avoidance patterns. Monday morning, I reviewed the maintenance logs to find a detailed report of the cleaning cycle I'd witnessed. But this time, additional data appeared in the technical notes information that hadn't been recorded in previous cycles. Cleaning around occupant. Standard avoidance protocols engaged. Residue removed from unoccupied areas only. Occupant avoidance protocols didn't exist in our equipment specifications. I researched Frank Delacroix's background, trying to understand why his cremation might have resulted in ongoing cleaning requirements. County records showed 15 years of homelessness, frequent arrests for vagrancy, and multiple attempts by social services to provide housing that he consistently refused. A social worker who'd known Frank mentioned that he'd been obsessive about cleanliness despite his circumstances. Frank kept himself and his belongings meticulously clean. She said he'd spend hours washing in public restrooms, organizing his few possessions, maintaining dignity even when everything else in his life had fallen apart. The cleaning cycles continued every night at 11 p.m. Exactly 7 minutes of intensive maintenance around something I couldn't see but knew was there. Retort number 3 had become home to someone who'd spent his final years without one, someone who'd found peace in a space that honored his dedication to cleanliness. I stopped trying to understand or prevent the cleaning cycles. Frank Delacroix had died alone, been cremated without ceremony, and apparently chosen to remain in the one place where his presence didn't disturb anyone. The automated cleaning honored his obsessive tidiness while providing him the solitude he'd sought during life. Sometimes I stay late to observe the 11 p.m. cleaning cycle, watching steam and solvents work carefully around Frank's invisible form. There's something comforting about equipment that adapts to accommodate needs it wasn't designed to meet, about systems that develop compassion for occupants who have nowhere else to go. Our maintenance logs continue to show nightly cleaning cycles for a chamber that technically needs no maintenance. But Frank Delacroix has found a home in retort number 3, and our equipment has learned to share space with someone who spent his life seeking clean, quiet places to rest undisturbed. The dead don't move on their own, but they seem to have their own ideas about where they belong. I'm Tom Bradley, and I've worked as a mortuary assistant at Riverside Memorial for 10 years. My responsibilities include preparing bodies for cremation services, maintaining the preparation room, and ensuring everything stays organized according to our strict protocols. Bodies have assigned positions on numbered tables, and they stay exactly where we place them until cremation time. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. The preparation room operates according to careful procedures designed to maintain dignity and efficiency. Each body receives a numbered identification tag corresponding to a specific preparation table, and I maintain detailed logs tracking every person's location and status. Bodies don't move once positioned. They wait quietly for their scheduled services while I handle the paperwork and preparation tasks that cremation requires. Our facility processes 12 to 15 cremations weekly, meaning the preparation room typically holds 4 to 6 bodies at any given time. The room is climate controlled, monitored by security cameras, and locked when staff isn't present. Standard mortuary security protocols that I've followed without incident for 10 years. Until the morning I found them arranged in a circle. It was a Tuesday in November when I discovered the first gathering. I'd left 5 bodies in their assigned positions Monday evening. Mrs. Patterson on table 1, Mr. Chen on table 3, Ms. Rodriguez on table 5, Mr. Thompson on table 7, and Mrs. Kowalski on table 9. Standard spacing according to our organizational system. Tuesday morning, all 5 were positioned in the center of the room, arranged in a perfect circle with their heads pointing inward toward a common center. They lay peacefully on their gurneys, as if they'd simply decided to have a quiet conversation in the middle of the night. I checked the security footage immediately, assuming someone had accessed the room after hours. The cameras showed the preparation room from lockup Monday evening through my Tuesday morning arrival. No human activity appeared in any of the recordings. The bodies had somehow moved themselves into the circular arrangement without anyone entering the room. I called my supervisor, Director Sandra Mills, who reviewed the footage personally and confirmed no unauthorized access had occurred. Equipment malfunction, she concluded. Maybe the gurneys rolled due to floor vibration or air pressure changes. But gurneys don't roll into perfect geometric patterns on their own. I repositioned the bodies to their assigned tables and continued with normal preparation procedures. Each person was tagged, documented, and properly positioned according to protocol. Nothing unusual about any of them typical elderly individuals who'd passed naturally, scheduled for cremation services throughout the week. Wednesday morning, I found them in a circle again. This time, I measured the arrangement carefully. Each gurney was positioned exactly the same distance from the center point, with bodies oriented in identical inward-facing positions. The formation was too precise for random movement, too organized for accidental positioning. Director Mills installed additional security cameras and motion sensors, thinking we might be missing subtle movements that could explain the gathering behavior. She also had our facility's structural engineer examine the floor for irregularities that might cause gurney migration. The engineer found nothing. The floor was level and stable, with no structural issues that could cause equipment movement. The new cameras provided comprehensive coverage of every angle, and the motion sensors would detect the slightest movement within the preparation room. Thursday morning brought the most disturbing discovery yet. Not only had the 5 bodies arranged themselves in their circular formation, but they'd been joined by 3 additional people who weren't scheduled for cremation until the following week. 8 bodies total, all positioned in a perfect circle, all facing inward, as if engaged in some kind of silent communion. The motion sensors had detected no movement. The cameras showed no activity. 8 people had somehow repositioned themselves without triggering any of our monitoring systems. I reviewed the intake records for all 8 individuals, looking for connections that might explain their gathering behavior. Different ages, different backgrounds, different causes of death. No apparent relationships between them, no shared experiences that might create bonds extending beyond life. But as I read through their personal histories, I noticed a pattern that made me reconsider their gathering from a different perspective. Mrs. Patterson had been widowed for 15 years and lived alone. Mr. Chen's children lived overseas and rarely visited. Ms. Rodriguez had no surviving family. Mr. Thompson had been estranged from relatives for decades. Mrs. Kowalski's husband had predeceased her by 20 years. All 8 people had died alone, with minimal family support and few social connections during their final years. Director Mills contacted a paranormal investigation team, thinking supernatural activity might explain the impossible gatherings. The investigators spent Friday night in the preparation room with sophisticated monitoring equipment, documenting any unusual phenomena. Saturday morning, they reported no paranormal activity detected during their overnight observation. But the bodies had formed their circle again, this time with the investigators' equipment carefully arranged around the perimeter as if the deceased had been mindful not to disturb the scientific instruments. "We've never seen anything like this," the lead investigator admitted. "No electromagnetic disturbances, no temperature anomalies, no evidence of supernatural presence. These people are just gathering, like they're choosing to be together." The pattern continued throughout November. Every morning, I'd find whatever bodies were in preparation, arranged in perfect circles, always facing inward, always positioned with geometric precision. The gatherings seemed to provide something the deceased had lacked during their final year's companionship: community, shared presence during the transition between life and final disposition. I began leaving them in their circular arrangements rather than repositioning them to assigned tables. Director Mills initially objected, citing protocol violations, but eventually agreed that the gathering seemed to provide comfort without harming anyone. "Maybe they need this," she said, after observing their peaceful expressions during one particularly large gathering. "Maybe some people form communities after death because they couldn't find them while living." I started staying late occasionally to observe the gathering process, hoping to understand how the repositioning occurred. The preparations room would be perfectly quiet until around midnight, when I'd begin to sense subtle changes in the atmosphere, not sound or movement, but a feeling of gentle activity, like people quietly organizing themselves for a social event. I never witnessed the actual movement, but I'd arrive each morning to find new arrangements, sometimes small circles of 3 or 4 people, other times larger gatherings of 8 or 10 individuals. Always precise, always peaceful, always suggesting intentional community formation rather than random positioning. The gatherings taught me that death doesn't necessarily end the human need for connection. Some people spend their final years isolated, lacking the family and social networks that provide comfort during life's most difficult transitions. But in the preparation room, they find each other, forming the communities they'd been seeking all along. I've learned to respect these overnight gatherings as an important part of the preparation process, not just physical preparation for cremation, but social preparation that allows isolated individuals to experience belonging before their final transformation. The circles provide something I can't offer through official procedures: the comfort of shared presence among people who understand what it means to face transitions alone. Our security cameras continue to show empty rooms while bodies rearrange themselves into formations that violate everything I thought I knew about death and movement. But the gatherings have become an accepted part of our facility's rhythm, a reminder that some needs transcend physical limitations and find expression through means I don't pretend to understand. Delivered packages don't return themselves, but sometimes they know where they really belong. I'm Ellen McCarthy, and I've been transporting cremated remains for Westside Memorial for 8 years. The work requires careful attention to detail, ensuring proper identification, obtaining delivery confirmation, and treating every urn with the respect families deserve during their most difficult transitions. Each delivery represents someone's final journey home, and I take that responsibility seriously. Transport procedures are straightforward but critical. I verify identification against delivery documents, confirm recipient information, and obtain signed receipts that protect both the family and our facility. Cremated remains are irreplaceable, so documentation must be perfect. In 8 years, I've never lost a delivery or failed to complete proper verification. My delivery van carries specialized secure compartments designed for urn transport, with climate control and shock absorption that protects delicate containers during transit. Each delivery receives individual attention, from careful loading at our facility through final placement in family homes. The work combines logistical precision with emotional sensitivity that families appreciate during grief. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson's delivery was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in November. Her daughter Linda had requested home delivery to avoid the emotional difficulty of visiting our facility so soon after the service. Standard compassionate accommodation that we provide for families who need additional support during the transition period. I loaded Mrs. Patterson's urn carefully into the secure compartment, verified the delivery address, and confirmed Linda Patterson's identification requirements. The urn was simple but elegant brushed bronze with engraved nameplate, containing 4½ pounds of ash from Mrs. Patterson's cremation the previous week. The drive to Linda's house took 25 minutes through suburban neighborhoods that reminded me why I preferred residential deliveries. Peaceful, tree-lined streets where families had space to grieve privately, away from the clinical environment of funeral facilities. Linda Patterson answered the door promptly when I arrived at 2:30 p.m. She appeared composed but tired, handling the formal requirements with the careful control of someone managing fresh grief. I verified her identification, explained the delivery process, and watched her examine the urn with a mixture of sadness and relief that characterizes successful remains delivery. "She looks perfect," Linda said, cradling the urn gently. "Thank you for bringing Mom home." I followed Linda into her living room, where she placed the urn on the mantel above the fireplace, exactly where she'd planned to display it during our earlier phone conversation. The positioning looked natural and peaceful, surrounded by family photographs that included many pictures of Mrs. Patterson during happier times. Linda signed the delivery receipt without hesitation, confirming that she'd received her mother's remains in good condition and that the delivery had been completed according to her specifications. I gave her the customer copy and retained our facility's documentation copy for filing. The entire delivery process took 15 minutes, completed according to standard protocols with proper verification and documentation. Mrs. Patterson had reached her final destination, and Linda seemed satisfied with the arrangements. I drove back to West Side Memorial, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes from completing difficult work with dignity and care. Another family had received the closure they needed. Another loved one had reached their chosen resting place. Friday morning, I arrived at work to find Mrs. Patterson's urn sitting on my desk. The same brushed bronze container, the same engraved nameplate, the same weight and appearance as the urn I delivered to Linda Patterson 20 hours earlier. But according to the attached delivery slip, the transport had never been completed. Delivery attempted November 14th, the slip read. Recipient unavailable. Return to facility for rescheduling. I checked my delivery logs immediately, confirming that I'd completed Mrs. Patterson's transport successfully on Thursday afternoon. My record showed Linda Patterson's signature, the delivery address, and the timestamp proving completion according to protocol. But our facility's tracking system indicated the urn had never left the building. I called Linda Patterson to verify the delivery and asked if there had been any problem with the urn's placement. Her response confused me completely. "I'm sorry, but no one has delivered my mother's remains," she said. "I've been waiting for the call to schedule pickup. When will someone bring Mom home?" I explained that I delivered the urn to her house Thursday afternoon, that she'd signed the receipt and placed it on her mantel. Linda insisted this conversation had never occurred. "I haven't spoken to anyone from your facility since the cremation," she said. "I've been home all week waiting for delivery, but no one has come to the house." I drove to Linda's address immediately, thinking perhaps there had been a mix-up with house numbers or recipient identification. The address matched my delivery records, exactly same street, same house number, same suburban neighborhood I'd visited Thursday afternoon. Linda answered the door, looking exactly as she had during our previous meeting, but with no recognition when she saw me. "Are you here about my mother's ashes?" she asked hopefully. I showed her the delivery receipt with her signature, but she examined it with genuine confusion. "This isn't my signature," she said, "and I've never seen this document before." I asked to see the living room where she'd placed the urn, but the mantel was empty except for family photographs. No sign that Mrs. Patterson's urn had ever been displayed there. No indication that Thursday's delivery had occurred. Linda walked me through her house, checking every room for any trace of her mother's remains. We found nothing. According to all physical evidence, Mrs. Patterson's ashes had never been delivered. But I remembered every detail of Thursday's successful transport, the careful loading, the suburban drive, Linda's grateful acceptance, the urn's placement on the mantel surrounded by family photos. I returned to Westside Memorial to review our security footage, hoping to understand how the urn had returned to our facility overnight. The cameras showed my Thursday afternoon departure with the delivery van loaded according to protocol. But they also showed my return to the facility at the end of the day with the same urn still secured in the transport compartment, as if the delivery had never been attempted. The footage contradicted my clear memory of successful completion. Our facility director, Margaret Torres, reviewed the situation with growing concern. My delivery logs documented successful transport, but our tracking system showed no record of Mrs. Patterson's urn leaving the building. The signed receipt existed, but Linda Patterson denied any interaction with our facility. "Either you're experiencing some kind of memory issue," Director Torres suggested carefully, "or something very unusual happened during that delivery." I requested a second delivery attempt, thinking perhaps I could resolve the confusion by completing the transport again. Friday afternoon, I loaded Mrs. Patterson's urn into the delivery van and drove to Linda Patterson's house. This time, something felt different about the neighborhood. The houses looked similar but somehow unfamiliar, as if I were seeing them from a different angle or during different lighting conditions. Street names matched my navigation system, but the visual details seemed slightly wrong. When I arrived at Linda's address, I found an empty lot where her house should have been. Foundation markers and utility connections indicated recent demolition, but no structure remained. A neighbor mentioned that the house had been torn down 6 months earlier after the elderly owner died. "Sweet lady named Patterson," he said, "lived there alone for years. Shame the family had to sell, but nobody wanted to keep up such a big place." I checked county records and found that Linda Patterson had sold her mother's house in June, well before Mrs. Patterson's death in November. Linda had moved to an apartment across town, but I had no record of her current address. The delivery I remembered completing had been to a house that no longer existed, for a woman who no longer lived there. I drove back to Westside Memorial with Mrs. Patterson's urn, trying to understand what had happened during Thursday's impossible delivery. Had I experienced some kind of hallucination or false memory? Had I delivered the urn to a demolished house and somehow convinced myself the transaction was successful? But the signed receipt remained in my files, documenting a delivery that couldn't have occurred to an address that no longer existed. I completed Mrs. Patterson's delivery to Linda's actual apartment the following Monday, watching her place the urn in a window overlooking the garden where her mother had spent her final years. This time, the delivery proceeded normally, with proper documentation and verification that remained consistent with our tracking systems. But I still think about Thursday's impossible transport the delivery that felt completely real, but led to a house that existed only in memory. I've learned that some journeys happen in spaces between what was and what is, carrying loved ones to places that transcend current addresses or physical locations. Mrs. Patterson found her way home through a delivery that existed outside normal logistics, visiting the house where she'd raised her family one final time before settling into her actual resting place. Sometimes, The dead need to complete journeys that the living can't understand, traveling roads that exist only for those who know exactly where they need to go. The dead don't watch the living, except when they're not ready to stop. I'm David Chang, and I've been chapel attendant at Riverside Memorial for 9 years. My responsibilities include maintaining our viewing chapel, assisting families during final visitations, and ensuring everything proceeds with appropriate dignity and timing. Most viewings last 30 minutes to an hour and off time for families to say goodbye before cremation or burial. The deceased lie peacefully while loved ones share final moments. Then we proceed with scheduled services according to predetermined timelines. But some farewells require more time than our schedules anticipate. The viewing chapel provides families with private space for final visits before cremation services. Soft lighting, comfortable seating, and carefully controlled atmosphere help families process grief while maintaining the peaceful environment that difficult transitions require. I monitor viewings discreetly, offering support when needed while respecting family privacy during intimate moments. Bodies prepared for final viewing are positioned to appear comfortable and peaceful, allowing families to remember their loved ones with dignity rather than focusing on medical or age-related deterioration. Proper preparation requires technical skill combined with artistic sensitivity, creating presentations that comfort rather than disturb grieving relatives. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had been prepared for Tuesday morning viewing prior to her scheduled cremation. 86 years old, died peacefully at home surrounded by family after a brief illness. Her granddaughter requested a private viewing for close relatives, with cremation to follow immediately afterward. I positioned Mrs. Whitmore in our chapel according to standard procedures, ensuring she appeared comfortable and serene for her family's final visit. Her granddaughter had brought flowers and a favorite photograph to display beside the casket, creating the kind of personal touches that help families process their loss. The viewing was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., allowing adequate time for family goodbyes before the noon cremation appointment, standard timing that accommodates emotional needs while maintaining operational efficiency. Mrs. Whitmore's family arrived promptly, her daughter Carol, son-in-law Robert, and grandson Michael, who appeared to be around 12 years old. They approached the casket together, but I noticed Michael seemed reluctant to get too close to his grandmother's body. "It's okay, honey," Carol told her son. "Grandma looks peaceful. You can say goodbye." Michael took a tentative step toward the casket, then stopped suddenly. "Her eyes are open," he said quietly. I looked more carefully at Mrs. Whitmore's face. Her eyes appeared closed exactly as I'd positioned her during preparation. But as Michael moved closer, I noticed something that made me step forward for a better view. Mrs. Whitmore's eyelids fluttered slightly, then opened to reveal alert brown eyes that focused directly on her grandson. "Mom," Carol said, approaching the casket with confusion and hope. "Can you hear us?" But as Carol leaned over Mrs. Whitmore, her eyes closed peacefully again. The brief moment of apparent awareness passed, leaving her looking exactly as she had when I'd completed the preparation procedures. I checked her pulse and breathing, finding no signs of life. Mrs. Whitmore was definitely deceased, showing no vital signs that might indicate misdiagnosis or coma rather than death. But when Michael approached the casket again, her eyes opened and tracked his movement with unmistakable awareness. "She's looking at me," Michael whispered, backing away from the casket. "Why is she looking at me like that?" I examined Mrs. Whitmore more closely, trying to understand what might cause the eye movements that appeared to respond to Michael's proximity. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the casket, maintaining focus with an intensity that suggested conscious attention rather than random muscular contractions. Carol called our facility director, who arrived within 20 minutes to assess the unusual situation. Director Patricia Santos examined Mrs. Whitmore thoroughly, confirming death while acknowledging the eye movements that occurred whenever Michael approached. "Sometimes muscle contractions can create the appearance of awareness," Director Santos explained, "but this seems unusually responsive to external stimuli." Michael refused to leave the chapel while his grandmother's eyes continued opening and watching him. "She looks sad," he told his mother. "I think she wants to tell me something, but she can't talk." The viewing extended past its scheduled endpoint, as Michael remained convinced that his grandmother was trying to communicate something important. Each time he moved toward the casket, Mrs. Whitmore's eyes would open and regard him with an expression that did seem remarkably sad, almost pleading. By noon, when cremation should have begun, Michael was sitting in a chair beside the casket, while Mrs. Whitmore watched him with steady attention. Her eyes remained focused on him for extended periods, blinking occasionally but never looking away from his face. "I can't leave while she's watching me," Michael said when his parents suggested ending the viewing. "She's trying to tell me something. I need to figure out what it is." Carol called her mother's doctor to report the eye movements, but he confirmed that Mrs. Whitmore had definitely died at home. "Sometimes families see things they hope to see," he suggested gently. "Grief can create perceptions that feel very real." But I was witnessing the same focused attention that Michael described. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes tracked movement, maintained eye contact, and seemed to convey emotional content that transcended random muscular activity. The viewing continued through the afternoon as Michael tried different approaches to understanding his grandmother's apparent message. He spoke to her about school, about memories they'd shared, about missing her presence in his life. During these conversations, Mrs. Whitmore's expression seemed to soften slightly, though her eyes never closed, while Michael remained in the chapel. When he stepped outside for breaks, her eyes would close immediately, but they'd open again the moment he returned. Around 4 p.m., Michael asked if he could hold his grandmother's hand. Carol hesitated, but Director Santos agreed that physical contact might provide comfort during the extended goodbye. As Michael took Mrs. Whitmore's hand, something remarkable happened. Her fingers moved slightly, not enough to grip his hand, but with enough pressure to acknowledge his touch. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it was clearly intentional movement rather than muscular spasm. "She squeezed my hand," Michael said with wonder rather than fear. "Just a little bit, but I felt it." I watched Mrs. Whitmore's face as Michael held her hand. Her expression became noticeably more peaceful, and for the first time since the viewing began, her eyes seemed less sad. The pleading quality in her gaze diminished, replaced by something that looked more like contentment. Michael continued holding her hand and talking quietly about how much he'd missed their weekly visits, how she'd taught him to play chess, how he'd take care of his mother the way she'd always taken care of the family. As he spoke, Mrs. Whitmore's grip on his hand gradually relaxed, and her expression became increasingly serene. By 6 p.m., her eyes had closed peacefully and remained closed even when Michael moved around the casket. "I think she's ready now," Michael said, releasing his grandmother's hand. "She wanted to make sure I'd be okay without her." The extended viewing had lasted 6 hours, far longer than any family visit I'd supervised. But something important had been accomplished during those hours of communication that transcended normal interaction between the living and the dead. Mrs. Whitmore's cremation proceeded the following morning without any unusual incidents. Her remains were processed normally and released to her family for scattering in the garden where she'd spent her final years. But I continued thinking about that afternoon when a grandmother's love proved stronger than death, when the need to ensure her grandson's well-being kept her present long enough to provide the reassurance he needed. Michael left the chapel with peace rather than fear, understanding that his grandmother's watchful care would continue even after her physical presence ended. I've learned that some final viewings serve purposes beyond simple goodbye. Some departures require extended negotiation between the living and the dead, time for both sides to accept the transition that death requires. Mrs. Whitmore showed me that love doesn't end with last breath. Sometimes it intensifies, finding ways to provide comfort that transcend the biological limitations we think govern life and death. Dead phones don't make calls, but worried parents find a way. I'm Patricia Wild, and I've managed office operations at Pine Ridge Memorial for 11 years. My responsibilities include handling family communications, maintaining client records, and ensuring our phone system operates efficiently during one of the most difficult periods in people's lives. Phone calls in the death care industry require special sensitivity. Every ring might bring grief, questions, or urgent family needs that demand immediate attention. Our phone system tracks all incoming and outgoing calls, with detailed logs that help us maintain professional standards and resolve any communication issues. Caller identification, timestamps, and duration records provide comprehensive documentation that protects both families and our facility during emotionally charged situations. The crematory serves families throughout the county, processing 50 to 60 services monthly with follow-up communications that can extend for weeks after completion. Families call with questions about paperwork, request for additional death certificates, or simply needing someone who understands their grief to listen patiently. But some calls come from people who shouldn't be able to make them anymore. The first unusual call arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. My phone system showed an incoming call from a number I recognized, Robert Henderson's direct line at his insurance office. Mr. Henderson had been cremated 3 weeks earlier after a brief illness, and we'd completed all family arrangements. I answered expecting to hear from a colleague handling Mr. Henderson's business affairs, but the voice on the line was unmistakably his own. Soft, hesitant, with a distinctive accent I remembered from our pre-need consultation meetings. "Please check on my family," he whispered. "Sarah's been working too hard since I've been gone. She needs to rest." The line went dead before I could respond. I called the Henderson family immediately, assuming someone might be impersonating Robert or that there had been a mistake with the caller identification. Sarah Henderson answered, sounding exhausted and overwhelmed. "Dad would have been worried about me," she said when I mentioned receiving a call about her well-being. "I have been working extra hours to keep his business running." But no one from his office called you, disconnected his direct line right after the funeral. I checked with the phone company, who confirmed that Robert Henderson's business line had been disconnected 3 weeks earlier. No calls could originate from that number, yet my system clearly showed the incoming call with his name and number displayed on the caller identification. 2 days later, I received a similar call from Margaret Torres, who'd been cremated 6 months earlier. Same whispered request, "Please check on my family." When I contacted her son Luis, he mentioned that his mother had always worried about his diabetes management, and he'd been neglecting his medication schedule since her death. The pattern continued throughout October. Calls from disconnected numbers belonging to people we'd cremated, always the same whispered message about checking on family members. Each time I contacted the families, I discovered they were indeed struggling with issues that would have concerned their deceased loved ones. I started recording the calls, thinking our facility director might need evidence of the unusual phone activity. But when I played back the recordings, something chilling became apparent. The voices matched exactly the memorial service recordings that families had provided for their loved ones' services. Robert Henderson's whispered phone message contained the same vocal patterns, accent, and speech cadences as the recording his daughter had played during his memorial. Margaret Torres's call matched her grandson's tribute, recording perfectly same voice, same emotional tone, even the same slight hoarseness she'd developed during her final illness. I compared multiple call recordings with memorial service audio, finding perfect voice matches for deceased individuals whose phone lines had been disconnected months or years earlier. Our facility director, Janet Morrison, listened to the recordings with growing concern. "Either someone is playing elaborate hoaxes using memorial service recordings," she said, "or we're receiving calls from people who can't possibly be making them." But the hoax theory fell apart when I traced the call's origins. Phone company records confirmed that the calls originated from the actual disconnected numbers, not from active lines that might be spoofing caller identification. The calls were somehow originating from phones that no longer existed in the telecommunications system. The frequency increased as winter approached, sometimes 3 or 4 calls per day, always brief whispered requests to check on specific family members. I began maintaining a callback log, documenting each call and following up with families to verify their well-being. Every family contact revealed legitimate concerns that matched the deceased's request. Widowed spouses forgetting medication schedules, adult children working themselves to exhaustion, grandchildren struggling with school or social problems. The calls identified real issues that required attention. In November, I received a call that made the situation more personal. My own mother's voice, soft and worried, asking me to check on my father's health. Mom had been cremated 2 years earlier, and Dad had been struggling with depression and neglecting his doctor appointments since her death. "He's not taking care of himself, Patricia," her voice whispered through the phone. "Please make sure he sees the doctor." The call originated from my mother's old cell phone number, disconnected since her death. But her voice was exactly as I remembered the same loving concern she'd expressed throughout her life, now reaching across death to continue caring for her family. I visited my father that evening and found him in worse condition than I'd realized. He'd been skipping meals, avoiding medical appointments, and withdrawing from social activities. The intervention that my mother's call prompted likely prevented serious health complications. Director Morrison contacted telecommunications experts to investigate the impossible calls, but they found no technical explanation for calls originating from disconnected numbers. "Your phone system is receiving calls that shouldn't be possible," the lead technician concluded. "The numbers don't exist in our network anymore." The calls taught me that parental concern doesn't end with death. The people reaching out through our phone system had spent their lives worrying about family members, and death hadn't diminished their need to provide care and protection. I stopped questioning the technical impossibility of the calls and started treating them as important family communications. When deceased parents whispered requests to check on their children, I honored those requests with the same attention I'd provide any worried family member. The callbacks created an informal support network that extended beyond our facility's normal services. Families received unexpected check-ins during difficult periods, connections to resources they needed, and reminders that someone still cared about their well-being. Sometimes I'd receive calls from the same deceased individuals multiple times, always requesting welfare checks when their families faced new challenges. The calls provided ongoing support that helped families navigate grief while maintaining the connections that death threatens to sever. I've learned that some phone systems receive more than technical communications. Some calls carry love that transcends disconnection, voices that continue providing care long after the speakers can no longer speak. Our phone logs document conversations that shouldn't be possible, but they serve families in ways that extend far beyond normal business operations. When my phone rings with calls from disconnected numbers, I answer with the respect due to parents who refuse to stop caring for their children. The technology may be impossible, but the love behind the calls is real. And that's what matters most in the conversations that matter most.